Can you also talk about the USMCA and what you're thinking about renegotiating that with the automakers?
Well, that's just an ongoing thing. It expires in about a year, and we'll either let it expire or we'll maybe work out another deal with Mexico and Canada. But look, Mexico and Canada have taken advantage of the United States, like just about every other country. In all fairness, if it's not them, I'm not blaming them. But every country, because we had stupid people running our country.
We have the lowest tariff of any country in the world. That deal can be better. Both the President Trump, and I agree on that. We have a number of discussions, our officials have a number of discussions on how that can be potentially structured. A lot of that will roll into this process of the review of what we call CUSMA, which is our agreement, you know this, but for everybody, agreement with the United States and Mexico. That review will start over the course of later this year. I mean, the individual country reviews, but the discussions will start later this year and into next year.
Canada is heading into a breaking point trade moment, and it's coming faster than most people realize. In the next mandatory review of CUSMA, the United States is signaling it may be open to letting the deal lapse. That's not a routine line. That's a threat with real economic weight. Because if CUSMA destabilizes, Canada doesn't just lose a talking point. It risks immediate uncertainty across auto supply chains, agriculture market access, manufacturing investment, and cross-border pricing overnight. And here's the part the headlines soften: this review isn't just a meeting. It's leverage built into the agreement itself. Washington doesn't need to announce new tariffs to tighten the screws. It can use the possibility of expiry to force concessions before talks even begin. So what you're watching now isn't a technical process. It's a high-stakes power test, one that exposes Canada's structural dependence on US market access, and the way modern trade deals can function like sovereignty contracts. Canada isn't walking into a routine review. It's walking into a pressure chamber. Canadian officials have already confirmed that formal discussions will begin early next year. And reporting and political briefings suggest the United States is signaling a more aggressive posture than the last round of negotiations. But you don't need insider quotes to understand the direction. You just need to understand the structure. Because when you build a trade deal with a review mechanism and a possible expiry pathway, you've created something that looks like cooperation but functions like conditional permission. In plain language, you've turned stability into a subscription, renewable only if the dominant power stays satisfied. And once you see it that way, the deeper story appears. The United States has hinted, through statements from senior officials, and through the political atmosphere around trade, that it is open to letting the deal lapse if Canada doesn't meet American demands. That phrase, "let it lapse," isn't casual. It's a loaded gun on the table. CUSMA is not just a document. It's the legal scaffolding underneath hundreds of billions of dollars of trade. It's the reason supply chains flow with fewer frictions, why rules are predictable, why investors assume continuity. So when Washington floats the idea of expiry, it doesn't need to pull the trigger to change the outcome. The threat alone reshapes the negotiation. This is the first liberation lens principle. In an asymmetric relationship, you don't need violence to win. You just need uncertainty. Because uncertainty is a tax on the weaker party. Letting CUSMA collapse would send shockwaves through policy circles for a reason. Canada's economy is not simply connected to the US market. It is structurally anchored to it. Geography, infrastructure, and decades of integration mean that a very large share of Canadian exports still go south, roughly 3/4 in many recent years. That's not a moral failing. It's a reality of power. And it means that when the US says, "We can walk away," Canada hears something else. "We can pull the floor out from under you." And here's the point mainstream coverage often avoids: that asymmetry is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Canada is often framed as a wealthy, stable, developed nation. But trade is not about vibes. Trade is about dependency, choke points, and who can survive disruption longer. In trade terms, Canada behaves like a smaller, rich-looking country with a structural sovereignty problem, rich in resources, technologically advanced, institutionally mature, yet constrained when facing a dominant neighbor that controls the destination market. Canada cannot credibly threaten the United States the way the United States can threaten Canada. And that means the entire negotiation starts with a silent hierarchy already in place. This is why the upcoming review is not just another meeting. It is a stress test of Canada's position inside North American capitalism, where the rules are written like partnerships but enforced like hierarchies. Now, some people will say, but the review is mandatory. It's built into the agreement. It's normal. And yes, the review mechanism is part of the design. But that's exactly the issue. When a powerful state can use a built-in review to reopen terms, demand concessions, and weaponize uncertainty, the review becomes a tool of discipline. Think of it like this. Imagine you live in a house where your landlord can renegotiate the lease every few years and casually mention, "I might not renew." You can paint the walls and decorate the living room, but you will always live differently when you know your stability is conditional. That's CUSMA for Canada. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The political context around the review is anything but routine. We've already seen how trade has been used as a blunt instrument. Tariffs have hit sectors like steel and aluminum. Threats have moved into strategic inputs, like fertilizer, including nitrogen and potash, commodities that sit under food security and industrial production. Even when tariffs create pain for US industries too, Washington has shown it is willing to use them anyway, because the purpose is not efficiency. The purpose is leverage. This is the second liberation lens principle. Trade policy is not just economics. It's governance by other means. When analysts describe this period as fragile, one of the most unstable phases in North American trade since the last renegotiation, they're pointing to a bigger shift, the erosion of the idea that rules alone guarantee stability. The US has demonstrated that it will reinterpret commitments through domestic political needs. And when the dominant power treats agreements as flexible instruments, the smaller partner is forced into permanent adaptation. Canada's official posture has been cautious, publicly emphasizing stability, cooperation, and good faith. But the private anxiety is structural. Canada's leverage is limited not because Canadian negotiators lack talent, but because Canada's position in the supply chain is subordinate to market access. Diversification away from the US market has been a national talking point for decades. Yet anyone who understands infrastructure knows diversification is not a slogan. It's ports, rail, pipelines, regulatory alignment, logistics ecosystems, and time. Diversification is expensive and slow. The US market is close, massive, and integrated. So Canada remains deeply tied to it. And that is why this story matters beyond Canada. Because Canada's predicament mirrors the position of many resource-rich countries in the global south, structurally dependent, politically constrained, economically vulnerable, even when they appear rich on paper. If you're watching from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Brazil, South Africa, this should sound familiar. Not because Canada is the same as your country in history or poverty levels, but because the logic of dependency is universal. When your prosperity depends on one dominant market, one dominant currency system, one dominant buyer, your sovereignty becomes conditional. And this is where Liberation Lens pushes deeper than mainstream commentary. We are told North America is a partnership. We are told integration equals stability. We are told rules-based trade is a neutral system that rewards efficiency. But neutral systems don't produce one-sided leverage this reliably. The Canada-US relationship is often narrated as friendship, shared values, shared defense, shared culture, shared border. But structurally, it resembles a hierarchy. The United States is the agenda setter, the rule writer, the state that can impose friction and absorb the shock. Canada is the rule taker, the state that must preserve predictability because unpredictability hits harder on the dependent side. This doesn't mean Canada is powerless. It means Canada's power is limited by the architecture of the relationship. And CUSMA is one of the clearest examples of how modern capitalism produces hierarchy without conquest. You don't need a colony to get colonial outcomes. You just need controlled access to markets, controlled standards, controlled routes, and controlled terms of exchange. So let's talk about stakes, not in abstract terms, but in real-world consequences. If CUSMA destabilizes, the auto sector feels it first. Not because cars are special, but because the auto industry is a perfect symbol of integrated capitalism. Parts cross borders multiple times before a vehicle is finished. Any disruption, tariffs, rules of origin changes, regulatory conflicts, can create immediate cost spikes and production delays. Agriculture feels it next. Farmers and food processors live on predictable access. Tariff-free or low-friction access to the biggest nearby market is not a luxury, it's the foundation. If that predictability weakens, uncertainty spreads through prices, contracts, and investment. Manufacturing follows. Energy, too. And then the broader economy. Investment confidence drops, currencies react, and businesses postpone decisions because the rules are no longer stable. And here's the brutal truth: the US doesn't need to fully collapse the deal to extract concessions. The threat itself is often enough. That's how leverage works. It's not the punch. It's the raised fist. Now, what is the US likely to push for? Reporting and policy discussion suggests Washington may target areas like agricultural access, dairy is the classic pressure point, digital trade rules, procurement, environmental and industrial standards, and any clause that can be reframed as unfair under domestic political narratives. But don't get lost in the sector details. Those are the surface. The deeper goal is structural, to reassert dominance. Because US trade politics today is not just about balancing accounts. It's about controlling terms in an era where trade is increasingly weaponized. Tariffs are no longer policy tools, they are bargaining chips. And the credibility of threats has increased because the US has shown it is willing to impose pain to get outcomes. Canada's traditional strategy, quiet diplomacy, relationship management, technical negotiation, worked best in a world where the US valued stability as much as Canada did. But we are not in that world anymore. We are in a world where domestic political incentives can reward disruption, and where winning is defined as extracting visible concessions, not maintaining quiet cooperation. So Canada enters this review facing a strategic dilemma. If it resists too hard, it risks triggering escalation from a partner that can absorb disruption better. If it concedes too quickly, it confirms the hierarchy and locks in structural dependency even deeper. And if it tries to diversify as an escape route, it collides with decades of infrastructure reality that cannot be reversed overnight. This is not just a negotiation. It's an economic identity crisis. And it forces a question that Canada rarely asks itself in public: what does sovereignty mean in a world where trade is a weapon? Because the myth of sovereignty is that it's a flag and a parliament and a national anthem. But economic sovereignty is something else. It's the ability to make choices without external veto. And when your prosperity depends on one market that can threaten to let the framework lapse, you are operating under veto power, even if nobody calls it that. This is why the rules-based order language often feels like theater to the global south. Because rules don't eliminate power. Rules institutionalize power. They turn raw domination into polite procedure. They make hierarchy look like mutual agreement. And they allow the dominant party to say, this is just the process, while the dependent party knows the process contains the threat. So what does the CUSMA review really represent? It represents a moment when North American integration reveals its true nature, that integration is not automatically stability. Integration can be leverage. Integration can be dependency. Integration can be a cage with soft walls. And here's a final liberation lens inversion that matters. Canada's story is a warning, not because Canada is weak, but because Canada is inside the club. Canada is part of the Western economic family. Canada is not a sanctioned state. Canada is not a geopolitical enemy. Yet even Canada can be disciplined through trade architecture. So imagine what this means for countries outside the club. If a wealthy G7 country can face this kind of conditional stability, what does that say about the rest of the world whose economies are tied to dominant markets, dominant currencies, and dominant financial plumbing? This is why trade wars are never just about trade. They are about who writes the rules, who enforces the rules, who gets exemptions, who gets punished, and who gets to redefine fairness when the political moment demands it. As the review approaches, the biggest question is not only what the United States will demand. The biggest question is what Canada will finally admit to itself. Will Canada keep living in the comfort of partnership language while operating in a hierarchy? Will it treat diversification as a slogan, or as a serious long-term sovereignty project? Will it build redundancy into its economy, new trade corridors, new industrial strategies, stronger domestic capacity, so that access to one market is not a national choke chain? Or will it continue to manage dependency rather than reduce it? There are no easy answers. But there is one clear reality: the CUSMA review is a moment of truth. It is a political confrontation disguised as a technical process. It is an economic reckoning disguised as a routine review. And it is a sovereignty test for a country that is rich in resources, rich in institutions, rich in international reputation, yet structurally constrained when the dominant neighbor decides to rewrite the terms. This is the next chapter of the Canada-US trade war. Not a headline about one sector. A structural fight over leverage itself. And if you want to understand where the global economy is going, don't just watch the tariffs. Watch the architecture. Watch who holds the veto. Because in a world where trade is weaponized, the real battlefield isn't the border. It's dependency. If this changed the way you see North American partnership, share this with someone who still thinks trade is just economics. Subscribe, and stay with us. This is Liberation Lens. And in a world of polite language and hard power, we don't follow the slogans. We follow the structure. See you in the next.